This podcast is brought to you by cdkeyoffers.com. Use offer code BROKENSILICON for 25% off Windows codes and Die Shrink for 3% off everything on the website. All right, let's get to the show. Welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and as I always do, let's just jump right into it. I'm very excited about today's guest. Why don't you introduce yourself?
All right. I'm Keith Cadera, and I am an artist in the industry. I've been doing this for a quarter century. I've done everything from concept art, modeling, texture, artist materials, rigging, UI, cinematics, and just basically anything on the art side of stuff since the late 90s.
Right. And you mentioned something there that I'd want to already highlight. You said rigging. I was at the Carolina Games Summit. I think that was, I don't even remember already. It was like 2 months ago. And I talked to someone at Funcom who was a rigger. And I was like, what does that mean? And this is the actual skeleton of the things being animated, right? That's its own job.
It is, and I think they were probably downplaying what they do to some extent. It's not just the skeleton. It is, sometimes they don't even do the skeleton itself. Sometimes the modeler will say, hey, I've intended for the joints to be here, here, and here. I've put in the bones, but they're going to go in and set up what else those bones do as far as deforming the mesh. So you might raise the shoulder, and that's got to then, through a series of percents and formulas, move the collarbone some percent of that up and raise on this rotation. You're going to be an elevation to that shoulder because you're pulling on the delts, and that pulls this. And then there might be a series of bones just floating around to pull pectoral muscles around. And that's a whole series of things that get baked into the animation on the export. But someone goes and sets that up. So me as an animator, when I pull this arm, you have twist bones that move these muscles some percent of the wrist turn. And that's a whole science in and of itself.
And that's just one job work. It's like, I remember talking to a recent guest who said that he was on a plane with someone at Rockstar, and they were one of the horse artists, that there were 6 horse artists. 6 people go into making a horse for Red Dead Redemption 2. Right. I wonder if people understand just how complex, AAA gaming making them has become. I mean, it's not like one guy makes the character models for even just, it's like one person even just makes the character models for a type of animal. They might do one part of an animal.
Yeah, it's not just that. It's just you might work on one part of the animal that is interacting with a whole system of customization. So how do I make this work, knowing that deeper in the game, we're going to have a series of helmets or augmentations or damage, or it's got to react to, let's say, this character or animal gets wet. How is this going to affect the way that, everything is so interconnected now. Not every game and not every character, but if you're trying to convey something, it might not be isolated the way it used to be. It might be connected through, audio. Everything has to come together and work together and function and be tested and run through the ringer. But it's some combination of hyper specialization and hyper communication.
Mm-hmm. Well, and before we move forward, I guess you wanted to say this from the beginning. So, Keith, you work at Ubisoft. You're willing to say you work at Ubisoft, but of course, you're not representing Ubisoft. Your opinions are your own as a games veteran, not as a representative of what Ubisoft thinks about everything.
Yeah, I'm not representing them in the least, and I appreciate them giving us the freedom to talk to great shows like you. And any questions or opinions I politely sidestep is just respecting my team and the efforts and knowing that things are constantly in motion. And even if I was excited to say something, planting that flag is not necessarily the right answer tomorrow. So it's just not worth me even attempting sometimes.
Right. And so I guess now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, I mean, what got you into playing? I mean, I assume you started in this career because you liked video games. Like, what got you into video games? What got you into this career?
Well, I born in the 70s, kid of the 80s, and I was there for basically for video games becoming a thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I watched every little nook and cranny of the local pizza place get filled with stand-up arcade machines, and I loved playing, the games everybody knows, and even the more obscure ones. I loved Moon Patrol and all those slightly fringe of the mainline early Atari stuff, and then console-wise, like everybody my age had a 2600, and then probably the game that I put the most hours into was Rust on the Master System. I fell in love with that thing and just played it. It was probably the first game I played where it wasn't a series of controls that you mastered to make what you want to happen on the screen. It felt so intuitive. It had a feel. You didn't have to figure out that you hold down after the jump to put the sword down. It made sense that of course you would. And it just felt fantastic. It felt better than the arcade version. It's one of those early successes that I felt transcended its arcade port, what it was ported from.
When did it start to become professional? Did you program it all on your own? Like, where did you go to college, if you don't mind saying?
Sure. Yeah. I didn't initially target game development as a career. It was always going to be art. Early on, thanks to John Carpenter and Rick Botti and all those guys, I wanted to do effects on a practical level. And then that combined with love of comic art. And then I started moving in that direction. And then Jurassic Park came out and the whole digital realm opened up. Meanwhile, I'm still a huge gamer, but games are not being made by large studios with art departments specifically. It was a lot more. You needed to have a very strong code side and computer science side, especially when we were talking about those old Atari stand-ups. That's just a few folks, mostly on the code side, and then there was no sitting there and with concept art and all that. But as I was moving through late high school and picking out an art school, it started becoming a real possibility that games were going to expand into, similar to movies, there's going to be an art department. There's going to be a lot of thought and craft put into that side of it. And as I went to Savannah College Art and Design, and I went in there, and they didn't have almost nobody did have a game development track, but they did have professors that saw this coming, and they got the PS1 net. I don't remember the Net Your Rose sets. It was a version of the PS1 that you could actually hook to a PC and code to it and do all of that. And kind of as a pilot program for adding game development to that school, they were doing that stuff. I got to see some of that. And at the same time, I was seeing how movies were project-based. And you'd go in, do a project, move to the next project. And I liked the idea of being on a team that stays together, grows together, gets better, find our strengths and weaknesses. And game development seemed to be more like that, where you could settle into a studio and a team and grow there. And I then pivoted one more time away from practical effects, comics, movie stuff into the game development stuff.
So it's interesting. Was the reason you didn't directly, because clearly you were being, if we were to talk about medias that were inspiring you the most, obviously everyone's inspired by movies and TV and books, but it seemed like games were what inspired you the most. You didn't go directly towards gaming, though. Is it because you just thought it was only programming? And because now it's funny to look back at, gaming's huge. It's the biggest medium, but it wasn't back then. Were you just kind of cautious if there'd be enough jobs?
I didn't think there was enough to chew on the art side at the time. I mean, clearly, it was getting there. The games were, especially when the CD-ROM era was hitting, and it was getting there. It didn't click yet that there was a place for me there. And then remember I was at SIGGRAPH 98, I think. And I started hearing the chatter. And all the way back then, we're going to be bigger than Hollywood. This is going to be bigger than Hollywood. All the way back then, they started feeling it, that it was about to take off. And that was kind of my choice to pivot then. So I was seeing how the movie and TV industry worked with the contract and project-based. Like, okay, well, there is a place for me here, and they're committed to pushing the art of this and doing narrative work and all this stuff. Like,
I guess that's a good point too. There was not that much narrative back then compared to what you see now. I mean,
and right when I was starting, literally the first few months was when that first Half-Life beta, not beta, it was a beta or demo, the Half-Life demo hit, and of course now kids who didn't grow up and experience that, seeing skeletal deformation animations on that modified Quake 1 engine was mind-blowing. Like, we're going to do this. We can tell stories in this thing. We can play back skeletal animation with that was created in an IK system and exported, and this is going to work. We're going to be able to do amazing stuff here.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Half-Life now, and you mentioned Halo before. Both of those are games that I think a lot of developers point to. Half-Life, for me, I missed the first Half-Life when it first came out, and I kind of missed Half-Life 2 for a while, but as it turns out, like, my gaming, I say gaming, it was really terrible at the time, but laptop broke, and I had a netbook, and I was like, oh, it turns out, what's Half-Life 2's requirements? It's like single-core processor and a gigabyte of RAM. So I started playing Half-Life 2, and I was like, this is how old this game is? This is better than... I can't imagine. I'm kind of envious of the people who bought Half-Life 2 at launch, because I think I finally played it in like 2008 or 2009, and I was like, this is mind-blowingly good for being this old of a game. I couldn't believe how good the acting, the voice acting was, the story. I was like, that really was a game I think everyone should try to play that still holds up, that really... It's still fun. It's still a fun game. It really is.
Absolutely. And again, like what I was saying, when they're saying we're going to be bigger than Hollywood, that is taking lessons from a century of how to use a camera and applying it where it matters, the stuff they do. And you know, the user, of course, has control of the camera. But if you're going to take the view screen of the big bad and you put it up, you're forcing the user to do the cinema trick. Then there it is. It's framed. There's the cinema trick of, okay, I'm below him. I feel that, you know, and they know how to do that stuff. And they knew how to do it back then. It was amazing.
What was like the first big game you worked on? And then how did you get to work at Ubisoft? Like as quickly as we can go through it, I am kind of curious, you know, like I looked at you work at Red Storm, right? I looked at the history of games they've made, and it's like, well, a lot of them, you know, there's quite a list, you know, like, but what were the first games you worked on, and then the first big games you worked on at Ubisoft?
Well, I started off at a little studio here in North Carolina called Random Games, and we did a PC only, family and lightweight card and board games. We did Scrabble, we did Upwards, Hasbro Classic card, all that kind of stuff. And then from there, I left there in 2000 to go to a place called iRock Interactive, which nothing is more late 90s, early 2000s .com boom than a studio with I in the name and the word interactive. So if you think about
everything in the 90s had like interactive in the names in the early 2000s
but it also had the I. So it was Interactive Rock Interactive. Like we always internally thought that was hilarious. But that was based around the idea of getting music licenses and incorporating that very tightly with the personalities into the game. And we worked on what was going to be an Ozzy Osbourne game based on kind of sort of the lore of his 80s stuff. And it was one of the craziest, most wonderful experiences of my career because, well, it was the .com boom and everything was possible. It all, you know, whatever, we can make that work. And then also that was the PS2 drop. So we pivoted from, this is a PC release, to we're going to make this a PS2 exclusive. And so we got to dig into that hardware and try to figure out how to make, and in retrospect, what was an open world, not open world, but large map flying game with huge sight distances and sky full of enemies was not the greatest choice for PS2, but with the promises that we were hearing, it was the perfect choice. Of course, that was kind of an overpromised console on some levels.
Right. I mean, and now you've got, a famous rock star on the list too for like more buzzwordiness, right?
Right. I literally could do a 3-hour show on that experience itself, mainly because now we're in the post Osbourne's show era. We were in the pre-Osbourne show era with kind of knowing that was coming, not being able to say anything about it, and trying to explain to potential publishers, we made a cool choice here with Ozzy. You're going to have to trust us. And it's like, no, who listens to Ozzy? No, who's heard of Ozzy in 20 years?
Yeah, because he kind of went from kind of forgotten has-been to huge again overnight,
right?
Because of that show.
And we had, one way or another, we kind of knew that resurgence was coming. And we made some very careful choices with that. But the timing worked out that when we eventually shipped the game, because we couldn't get that buy-in, Ozzy was stripped out of the game. All your audience that are avid rarity collectors, I do have the Ozzy versions of that game, but where we have Ozzy models riding the dragons, and it was pretty crazy. But that's not what shipped. What ended up shipping instead of Ozzy's Black Skies was a game called Savage Skies, which still I think is an underrated gem of that era, because flying crazy creatures that I personally got to concept, draw, model, texture, rig, animate. Only time in my career that because it was a pretty small studio working on what was a next gen thing, we didn't have specialty teams. It was just get it done, and I got to tackle. And the game, was divided into factions based on different parts of Isaac's career. So I got to do the cool undead stuff and just go nuts on the concepting of, here's a giant flying eyeball with tattered bat wings and claws, and sure, go model that. Okay, approved. Go animate that. And that was a really unique experience that's never going to happen probably again for people who are launching on a mainstream console. I got the privilege of working on just a ton of Tom Clancy stuff, who I loved as an author. And to those younger listeners, that was a real person who wrote real books. That a lot of the games you think of as just a game that says Tom Clancy's on it are pulled from at least long ago, that have since morphed and changed and grown and expanded to include bigger audiences. But the Ghost Recons, Rainbow Sixes, the earlier Rainbow Sixes, all of those early ones I had some part in, mostly effects, lighting, cinematic stuff.
So, for example, did you work on Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter 2? I think that was kind of like a launch-ish PS3 360 game.
Yeah, and Graw 1 as well. Island Thunder, Summit Strike before that.
So I wonder if you remember, because I actually played Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter 2 quite a bit. What did you do for that game? I just want to pick out one example of something I played, just because I'm curious. Okay. What did you do for that one, if you remember?
Right in the arc of my career, that was right when I was starting to have touched enough things that I would have main assignment. And I think main assignment, if I'm remembering that game, I was going to say I did briefing cinematics, but I think that ended on the Summit Strike one. So Graw 2, I was doing lighting and effects for multiplayer maps, I believe, if I remember right. And then I think I did some of the damage models for some stuff when you blow up like the Panhard tanks and like the ADATs and stuff. We needed damage versions of those models. I believe I was just grabbing some of that stuff off of, were we still using, I forget what we're using for source control, but I would just grab those and make damage versions and set those up as the damage versions for stuff.
Like different parts of the hitbox and what weapon did what damage to that and where it crumbles or...
Literally the visual model. I grab the visual model and, take it into 3D Studio Max and, damage it physically, retexture it as a damaged version, assign some particle effects for the sitting and smoldering, and then that would be the damaged version after you blew that up for an objective for multiplayer stuff.
And I remember that era right there was right when vehicles taking damage actually started to have, I mean, I'll be honest, any amount of like real continual effects. Like, as if I'm thinking before that, I'm thinking of like maybe the first Mercenaries game. You would shoot a tank with a rocket, there'd be an explosion, but then the tank would just maybe have a small smoke come out of it. And it looked the same no matter where you hit the tank. It takes 3 RPGs to kill the tank. Its weakness is in the back, I guess. But really, it goes from smoking to fire smoking to blowing up. There's no cracks in it or deformation. Look at modern Battlefield games, and it's like little tweaks to little bullet holes, and like this part of the track is now sagging a little because it got hit at this angle. It's so much more complex now.
And there's full, I mean, not specific about any specific games, but just how stuff's done now. There's full physics sim going on for entire suspension systems. You've got your trailing links and the camber links and all this stuff, and things can be damaged, and you'll see a front wheel flop over, and then the vehicle starts tracking left, and all that stuff is happening in real time now. It's incredible.
Which I'm glad I actually picked that one game then in this time period, because the next like main point of discussion I want to bring up then is, you've been around for a while. What do you remember regarding the effects of new consoles and like what you could do that was really new in a few generations? So like, for example, going from, the PS2 era to the 360 PS3 era, when you got those dev kits, I'm curious, and Advanced Warfighter 2 would have been one of the first games made on the 360. What was the first thing that was noticed that was a big deal? Obviously, it's way, processors 10 times stronger, graphics card 10 times stronger, quadruple the RAM, or probably more than that back then. It's like 10, 20 times the RAM back then, I swear. Like, what was the biggest thing you guys noticed that allowed you to actually make a new type of game?
There was shifts, every generation there's a shift. That was the first time I remember as an art team, us talking specifically about how we need to shift certain ways we think about building stuff. Because that was, despite it showing up on the original Xbox, it just was, there was not enough of it. The shaders came to town, basically. The pixel shaders changed the way we'd think about building things. We don't need to spend huge portions of polygon budget to represent really nice brick, because we can do that with normals and materials in ways that was kind of sort of doable in the first Xbox, but prohibitively expensive. And before that wasn't possible at all. Like just a specular highlight was expensive before Xbox, the original Xbox. But now we have proper DirectX shaders with normals, and when we have specular maps, and we have all this stuff, and it changes the way you build things. You don't necessarily need to represent everything. In fact, you don't want to represent everything with geometry, because, like we were talking about the rigging, all that, it's all give and take. But trying to rig certain things that would be easier to deal with UV tugging and all kinds of stuff, it changed everything. Just the GPU shader stuff coming online.
Well, and I love asking these types of questions, because if you were to ask Sony, they're like, the cell processor can do everything,
Right.
And it's just like, but I like talking to actual people who build these games. Like, was it the processor? Was it the RAM? Or was it? It sounds like you're saying from Xbox to Xbox 360, and I assume that includes PS2 to PS3, it was the graphics power for you was the biggest deal on that one.
Well, for me at that time, yeah. And to some extent, PS3, again, this is just from where I'm sitting, not an engineer.
Yeah, I know.
It felt like PS3 was a much more difficult beast early on in its life. It was, because it wasn't, the Xbox was the first of it's an x86 in a box. You guys know how to use this. Go use it. And then 360 was, it's that, but way better. And meanwhile, Sony was still doing here's PS1, PS2, radically different architecture. What they call that? Emotion engine?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. Radically different, relearn everything, figure this guy out. And then they did that again on PS3. And, PS3 eventually sung like a violin eventually, but that was still in the Sony stuff is weird phase. And so I just remember having, Xbox and 360 dev kits on my desk because they were far more accessible for me to get on there and run my performance stuff on there and make sure all my stuff works.
What do you believe? I don't think I've ever asked this question exactly this way yet to a developer. A lot of like you said, you were worried about, this is just my perspective. Almost every developer I've spoken to has the same perspective you have, by the way, on the 360 versus the PS3. But it's interesting how they all say by the end of the generation, the PS3 wasn't actually hard to program for. And in fact, the PS3 was very powerful. What made it sing like a violin, like you said? Was it that you just figured out how to use its weird eccentricities? Or was it that the dev kits got better? Or what specifically made it easier?
Well, since I didn't have to do any of that, I'm going to be doing a lot of guessing on that. But we're an industry of people who do talk and do share stuff and do want to help each other. I'm sure a few game developers conferences went by and talks were given, and people move around studio to studio and go, no, that's not how you do that. I don't know if that's what changed. Something changed. Whether it was just time, could have just been time. But I know that a lot of the can we get that to work? Like all that went away and it was fine.
Yeah, because I guess what I'm kind of trying to get out with that question is the perception I get isn't just that developers eventually, and I put this in quotes, figured the PS3 out. It feels like eventually it was also easy near the end. So you didn't just figure out all the tricks you had to do. Also, you figured out, if we just do things exactly this way, it isn't hard. That's what it seems like. Am I wrong? Is that the perception you got?
That very well could be the simplest way to put it. I think. I think there's we're all developing on PC. That's just the fact of the matter. Like nobody has some strange bioluminescent biocomputer they're building stuff on. We're making a PC, and those Microsoft consoles, the first and second generation Microsoft consoles, that's basically what we're working on here. Like that's pretty easy. Like this goes right over there, just goes from here to there and it works. So really anything that wasn't x86 is going to be a little harder, right? Even if it's not hard, it's not sitting there with x86 on it.
It's not the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and eventually Sony agreed with you,
Yeah, right.
Like you said, graphics, the upgrade in graphics was kind of the biggest deal, going from PS2 to PS3 or really Xbox to 360. Right. From 360 to Xbox One, PS4, everyone says was it the RAM that was the biggest thing you noticed?
It was RAM, and if I remember right, I think the RAM even expanded on 360 not too far before launch, if I remember right.
They were going to go with a 1/4 gigabyte, and last minute they changed it to 1/2 gigabyte because I believe Cliff Bleszinski convinced them at the last minute that Gears of War would look like crap if they couldn't give him 1/2 gig. That's what I remember.
I'm glad you said the story that I wasn't going to say, because I wasn't 100% sure if that's anathema or what really happened, but that's the reality in my head. And generally, unless I have hard facts, I don't like regurgitate stuff I've heard. But yeah, that's the story I heard too.
And so that was the biggest deal then, though. 1/2 gig still wasn't a lot. Right. Going to PS4, getting to 8 gigabytes. Okay, let me ask you this. What was the most important thing? The fact that every Xbox One and PS4 had a big hard drive, or the fact that they had 8 gigabytes of RAM?
As someone who, at the beginning of, this is my whole career. It's not a current thing. You start off with a budget. You get your footprint. Like, this is how much your art can sit on, whatever the media is, right? You get a footprint, you get memory use, and you get milliseconds spent rendering. That RAM helps. That opens my budget up a ton. So that fee is massive. The hard drive is not as big a deal for me as the
Mhm.
artist, because real time stuff, the source art is not usually that huge. It's your storage is always going to be bigger than your hot RAM at the time. So that was usually the bigger bottleneck.
So moving then to the PS5 and Xbox Series X,
Mhm.
what's the biggest thing you noticed moving to this generation? I am really curious for each of these console generations. Like, what was the thing where it's like, oh, finally we get to do this? What was the big thing?
Here's where I'm going to put on, like, I'll leave my developer hat on. I'm going to put the user hat on too. I wasn't crying out for more graphics horsepower so much as either developer or user, but the experience that the SSDs bring, the instant
Mhm.
on, the instant loading, that brought back some of what I feel, again, as a user, we have very slowly lost as console kids. Because, it started as you slap a cartridge in, hit
Yeah.
on, you're going. That's it. And we've lost that slowly more and more and more, starting with, okay, we're loading off CD-ROMs. That's going to take a little more time. And then we're going to get our patches. There's a million reasons, but that experience has been eroded. And I feel like it's back with my Series X. I turn that on and I pick the game. I hit quick resume, comes right off the SSD. And I'm not just loaded the game. I'm back at the moment I stopped last week.
Mm-hmm.
That for me is bigger than any major graphics advantage or any other stuff that's going on in there. Now, I know your audience is screaming and boiling that, they're all the resolution and frame rate and all this. But I think they've begun to focus more back onto the user experience, and I love that about it.
Well, you say the user experience. I mean, frame rate is the user experience. When people ask me what's the biggest thing that feels next gen on these consoles compared to the previous gen, I'm like, well, it's that all games run at 60 frames now. And I remember before this gen started, Ubisoft specifically, there were games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla and others that were like, oh, we're targeting 4K 30. And I was like, no, don't target 30. And right before launch, it seems like Ubisoft and a lot of other developers made the decision, hey, we're passionate for 60 frames because 1800p at 60 is way better than 4K at 30. I mean, what are we talking about?
What's funny is as much as I will remove myself from the bleeding edge lust in this discussion, my favorite game, Rastan, ran at 62 back in 1986. So yeah, 60 is a nice number to sit at.
And even some games now have 120 hertz modes on console. So yeah, I mean, I think it's all of it, right? It's the quick loading, all of the features, the snappiness, and the fact that nothing feels jittery now. It's just so smooth, the new generation.
Right. And the I still have my old Xbox, what do they even call it before the series started?
Xbox One.
Yeah. Thank you. I think my brain wanted to call it the X-Bone, and part of my brain said, no, you're being recorded, don't call it that. But yeah,
Microsoft got very mad when people called it that around launch for some reason. Yes.
Yeah, it's been drilled into me not to say that. But yeah, the thing that was aging there was the snappiness of the UI. Once you're in game, it was still okay, but it was just a terrible experience to get the game from. And I like physical copies of things, from the disc to the screen was just a slog.
Mm-hmm. Well, all right. So we've kind of covered some of the more general aspects of transitioning to the newer consoles. And I think you've said what we would expect. I wasn't actually quite sure for the 360 if you were going to say the amount of RAM or the horsepower, but it seems like the order it goes is horsepower, and then for PS4 it was the RAM, then for PS5, Xbox Series it was the SSD, which is what most people say. But we have a reader mail question here from a supporter on Patreon, and Trey Drolet writes in. He says, how much more time-consuming is it to make high-quality assets of any kind versus PS2 or PS3 era? If not harder, how much more time? So I guess let's just stop at PS3 era. So which is already 2 gens ago, if you can believe it. So from the PS3 era to PS5, how much more time goes into making a character model versus then?
This is one of the questions I was worried about picking the bones off of earlier, but a lot of our tools are better now. Certain things we can get through faster. Certain the departments are specialized. We have a rigger to do some things. So getting an asset from concept through model to where I can animate it. A lot of that actually is our personal workloads look about the same, but we're doing smaller, more specialized chunks of things. But that asset that would have represented just my work before, if you zoom out and look at the human hours dumped into it, it is far more time consuming. But it's only because there's so much more going on there.
So, it's funny. Every generation, it seems like games take longer to make. Like I remember during like the PS2, Xbox era, I mean, I think Halo 1 was basically made in a year, Like the games took about a year to make back then, maybe a year and a half, depending on what's required. And then in the PS3, 360 era, I mean, I remember when just like comes off the top of my head, like what Gears of War 1, 2, 3, Resistance 1, 2, 3. It seems like games back then took 2 years, by the end of the gen, 3 years. And now it's like, I mean, heck, where's The Last of Us Factions? They can't even get the multiplayer done. It seems like games take like 4 to 5 years now. And specifically, I butted into this. I feel like people are expecting games to take 6 years now, because I remember when I leaked that God of War's sequel is going to be revealed. When did I leak that? I think that was before the PS5 came out. And everyone said there's no way they'll confirm that comes out. That'll be 3.5 years after the previous game. And I'm like, shouldn't we be expecting games to be done in 3.5 years? Do you think games are going to keep taking longer to make necessarily? Or do you think we've probably hit about where we're going to be at, about 4 years for a cycle?
I mean, your show is kind of named after the inability for trends to continue forever. There's probably got to be a limit, right? But expectations drive the growth of what you got to put in. And I think we're probably still in the midst of, they expect X plus 1. So we're going to go X plus 1.5, and we're going to put that in there, everything but the kitchen sink and the kitchen sink. And that's, speaking industry wide, not anything I'm personally involved in, but that is going to keep going till it can't, I'm sure, because it's got to be cooler, bigger, and more engaging. It's got to give you what you felt last time plus.
Well, in your opinion, though, at what point does a studio have to make that decision deliberately themselves, right? Because if you look at, this absurd term, I think that was brought up by some Microsoft studio called quadruple A. It was like brought up in some jobs listing, and people keep saying it now. The only game I really think of that's quadruple A is like, I don't know, Red Dead Redemption 2 and GTA 5. I mean, those were games that took $500 million before that was the standard, and are like, I mean, they're huge. They're like, they take like 6-7 years to make. That's big. At what point, though, do you think other studios need to just go, maybe the game doesn't need to be this big. Maybe we're done. Ship it. Maybe don't add all this content.
I think we've quietly seen that, because it wasn't that long ago that having a multiplayer, to me that long ago, we're actually probably talking 15 something years, but having a multiplayer mode at all was an oddity or a specific bullet point feature. Like, hey, this has multiplayer. Holy moly, this is cool. Then that became expected, even for games that really shouldn't have it.
Really should not have it.
Right. So that got huge. And then at some point, and I'm not going to name names, because I don't even know what the status of some of the stuff is out there right now, but a lot of those games that are famous for their multiplayer started quietly shrinking, then dropping the single player. So I think we've seen what you're talking about already happening. They're saying, we're just going to focus on the part you like, if you don't mind. Is that okay?
Yeah. I mean, and I guess what I'm kind of saying, though, is, so it sounds like you think that not to put like a firm number, I'm not literally saying half the studios, but a lot of studios are going to keep experimenting with bigger, and then a lot of them have probably said, we know what needs to go into a game. We're sticking to 4-year cycles and just cutting content we don't really need.
And I think there's going to be some of that. I think probably there's a lot of watching the shows like this and the fandom and stuff and seeing what are they actually enjoying, because we'll improve the stuff you're enjoying if we can figure out what you're really loving here. But if why would we spend and by we, I shouldn't even say we, why would they spend a ton of time polishing the stuff that nobody's looking at?
So I want to move into the idea of console optimization because I think we've kind of been dancing around what goes into that. So Falto writes in and he asks, "Hello, my question is regarding console optimization." And he puts it in quotes. "How exactly are you guys able to make a game run better on a console with similar hardware to a PC? For example, if I built a PC with the same specs as a PS4, would I actually get weaker performance overall? Or in other words, what's the console secret sauce?" And I kind of want to jump into this too because before I take your answer, I've always had a problem with the term secret sauce. As someone who analyzes hardware kind of for a living now, I've always, like, when I really drilled in, gone, I don't think there's secret sauce. I think this is why it's running better. I think I can explain it. It's not a secret. And in fact, I even looked for a recent release to find an example. I was like, how is literally just randomly I picked, how is Far Cry 6 performing? I looked it up. Okay, PS5 seems to have better geometry and reflections of the Xbox Series X, although it's very slight. And the Xbox Series X runs at a slightly higher resolution. Sometimes it's a dynamic resolution. And then the PS5 loads half a second faster. I can explain all of this. We've already seen the geometry engine in the PS5. We know the Xbox Series X has more bandwidths, which would help with a higher resolution. We know the PS5 is a faster SSD. I don't see any of this as being secret here. Like literally, is there like a 20 to 40% boost that consoles get over the equivalent PC hardware? Or do you think it just has to do with how much optimization is done for all of the different hardware on PC?
I think to some extent it's a super simple answer, and you kind of nailed it there to some extent. It's known quantities. Like when you're putting out a release for a known piece of hardware, and of course I could before last half generation when we started doing that, I could have said you have one target hardware spec. Of course, then PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, and you get that half gen, so you might have to hit a few things. But before that, console is the console, and you could sit team of engineers down, and they could bring things right to the limit of the memory cap, right to the limit of the millisecond budget of this and this and this feature, and they could tell an artist, hey, literally, if we take the particle count down by 4 in this scene of your big smoke clouds, we don't have a single frame rate dip this whole time. They could tell you stuff that granularly because it's a known quantity, instead of in the PC realm. Even if you're shooting for that exact spec, there's so much flux between even brands when there shouldn't be, or just the way you set up your PC and in the BIOS setting, the speed of your RAM to get a little more stability. There's just so much going on. Not to mention that your software is running on a stack of subsystems of the OS and whatever launcher you're using and all. There's so much stuff going on. Plus, you could have Spotify going, and it's just a different world in there. I don't know if it's certainly not a failing of the PC hardware itself. It's a different environment.
You would say there is an advantage, but maybe if I'm hearing you right, it's not like an exact percent boost in performance so much as it's like we were able to fit more in less RAM half the time is what it usually is, right? Or am I wrong?
If I'm going to step outside of everything and stand over in the corner as my own studio somehow, and my goal is to make something with a performance bullet point in the box that it's going to run. I guarantee it's going to do this at this frame rate. And I want to do that on a console. I just want to do it on a console because I know that I'm sitting there, and if I get that experience out of my dev kit, my consumer's getting it for sure. Whether I spend forever optimizing it or not, I know that it's for all intents and purposes a 1-to-1 from my desk to the living room of everybody on the planet. And I can see how that would be, I don't know, frustrating or not fun to hear for PC fans. But the reality is I can't count the variables when you're dealing with PC hardware. It's just not possible. There's stuff that, like, I don't know how you'd even track it down sometimes. I see forum posts and things like, I have X, Y, Z, and I have this problem. And I'm like, I feel bad for whoever's reading that support ticket because I don't even know where you'd start. because those specs seem fine to me.
Well, let me transition then into this question. So Laws writes in and he says, "Hi, Tom and Keith. Are the games currently in development made purely for the new consoles, or is cross-compatibility with the older gen here to stay for a while?"
This is interesting in relation to when we met, the stuff we were talking about. This was not that long ago, but it was long enough ago that we not predicted, but we saw some of the stuff that's happening right now coming with the supply chain problems. We saw at the time we already had chip shortage that hadn't been going on a while, but I think we both said something to the effect of that's the beginning of what's going to be a series of, if not dominoes, a series of isolated events of supply chain stuff. And I'm not gonna pretend to know what's being talked about in marketing offices across the industry or everything, but I do know that if we aren't sure as a entire pastime and hobby, if the demand for the next gen is being filled, I don't know why we would then exclusively target an unfilled series of slots under TVs across the planet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're not going to put out exclusives. I wouldn't put out exclusives if people are there. Go, that's great. I don't have that. Here's money, no console. And until you can go to the average store and there's always the next gen available to buy, I would imagine, this is just me imagining, you're taking sales away from the experience that you're trying to provide with your software if they can't run it.
Well, so I've heard this point brought up before by other people. And for example, the Xbox Series X is selling fantastic. And the PS5 is literally outselling what the PS4 was in aligned sales. And yet you saw after about a year, everyone dropped support for PS3. Now, so if you make the argument, yeah, but there's people who want a PS5 or a Series console that can't get one, we're actually ahead of the game compared to the previous gen. Now, is the reason that you'd want to support them because, there's just so much also more demand for the new consoles than there were back then and you don't want to leave them out? Or is it that you were just, to put it one way, from what I've heard, so tired of developing for those half gigabyte of RAM 360s and PS3s? Is that a reason the support was dropped for the last gen so quickly back then? Or is because if you strictly make the argument, but so many people don't have a PS5 yet, it's like, well, more have PS5s than have PS4s, so what happened back then?
Right. Well, I guess I'm going to reply with another question. Do those numbers mean anything now? Because in that time, we're looking at across 3 generations now.
Mm-hmm.
Gaming has changed as far as what has happened and what it's been the result of a very positive thing of reaching out and trying to super expand who we consider part of our gaming culture. So when you're going from PS3 to PS4, you may talking about a pool of PlayStation enjoyers that's one size, and in the meantime, we've whether it be just from the genres or being welcoming to more groups, yeah, you may have hit those numbers, you may have surpassed those numbers, but the percent of people who are ready to move on is actually much smaller than you were able to serve.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if those numbers alone, without seeing the percent of people who really are sitting there waiting to buy it, I don't know if those are directly relatable on a pure number of consoles moved into living rooms level.
Well, I guess now that I think about it, to answer my own question, I guess an argument you could make would just be, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, we know that there's 10 million people who want to play this Far Cry, and half of them are on PS4. Right. Well, so at the end of the day, why would we not try to make that money? And also at the end of the day, hey, look, Far Cry 3, I guess Far Cry 3 actually was on the PS3 and PS4, and it ran very badly comparatively on the PS3. And you could say that's true now comparatively, but I don't know. I think there's just a lot more of back then. It's like, hey, look, like we can't even make these games on the last gen consoles, so that's why we're ignoring them. But or maybe you disagree though. Maybe you thought maybe they could have, because again, Far Cry 3 was on both. It was cross gen, just like Far Cry 6 is.
Like we talked at the Carolina Game Show about my love for the ability to do more with less and all that kind of stuff. When you're talking about cross-gen, that is where the exception lies. You don't want to give a different experience with the same title, right? You don't want to call two things game iteration 9 when they're clearly not the same experience. I can see the disparity when we went from PS3 to PS4. I haven't played a game cross-gen. I take that back. I looked at Resident Evil Village. I found it pretty playable on both, but I certainly enjoyed it more on Series X. As far as if we're going to continue supporting it, I really do think the numbers we moved before don't necessarily relate to how big the potential audience is now, because it is just so mainstream now. It's hard to find people who don't play games than it is to gather a group of gamers now.
Is there any concern, though, that like making these games for the previous gen is going to hold back the next gen at all? And like the performance or even what's going on in the game? You know, I talked to someone at Sony Santa Monica on the show working on the new God of War. His answer basically was, well, it's not a new IP. Frankly, we've designed the God of War before the PS5 came out, so it's really not going to change the overall design of the game. But I think that excuse only works maybe 2 years into development. I mean, how long until it really does make a huge difference? Or how long until the previous gen just runs horribly? I've heard that Battlefield 2042 ran fine on the next gen consoles, but on the PS4, it barely even can run at a reasonable frame rate, like above 20 frames.
I mean, we've heard this generations past. We heard this before. I'm sure there's certainly a grain of truth to if you're supporting a platform past the time when people want that experience, but you are insisting on doing it, and you want the same experience across both the new and the old. There's going to be cuts there. I don't think it's going to be a problem for long. And I've looked at some of the other questions that are coming, and people are like, and the one that just went by about how if I build a PC to the same spec, it's not quite the same experience. This happens every time we get a new generation. These generations are around, whether it's sometimes it's 4 years, sometimes it's 14 years, depending on what really what you count as a generation. But these things age pretty quickly, and the PC fandom pushes their hardware up, and it crosses like a sinusoidal wave across each other. Like, this is an argument we're not going to be having in a year and a half, 2 years, right? The PC spec will fly on the trajectory roughly where it's going, and we'll have this console generation go from the cheapest way to get the best bang for the buck to behind the curve a little bit, and then it'll shoot back up. So I think these are questions that only come out at this point. And this is something, these questions could only really be a super concern for, I don't know, 6 months or so at a time, every 5 or so years going back 4 or so generations. I don't think it's going to be a big one.
I mean, I guess, we're a year into the console gen at this point. Would you argue, so you're saying Far Cry 7 won't be on PS4, though? Because that's when the conversation's gone on for longer than usual, right?
I think, okay, I'll just say I don't know. I did not work on 6, certainly not on 7. And I think somebody who just is a fan of watching this stuff go, had nothing to do with it, would say it'd be pretty unlikely if we're still doing that. But we're in a really unlikely time as far as supply chains and uptake of hardware. So in normal times, I would think we're probably on the path of moving along. But I honestly couldn't predict it for multiple reasons, just that these are just unprecedented times.
Mm-hmm. And so, you do believe that the unprecedentedness of how much people are gaming now and want the new stuff but can't is maybe accentuating or extending it a little bit.
Absolutely. I think everybody is underestimating how large the gaming fan base is now. It's it's shocking. We were just talking about, not that long into this conversation, how uh, it is bigger than the other entertainment medias. It is ubiquitous. And whether it's just Candy Crush on your phone, it's still touching you. Like, it is commonplace to be a fan of gaming on some level.
Let me pivot this type of question to like a different facet of like, what platforms here. Like Illyrium writes and he says, "Hey, Tom and Keith, thank you for doing this interview. It's much appreciated. Do you happen to have any insight on the impact of AMD's sponsorship of an Assassin's Creed game, for example? The first game they sponsored, they lost badly in benchmarks, but then came out on top in the following two games, indicating that developers were now putting an effort to reward AMD's hardware, maybe more so than NVIDIA. A follow-up question would be, does AMD really need to actively sponsor titles for its customers to benefit choosing AMD on Newegg or something for their gaming PC? Like, and I really don't, like, how much does AMD, like I've talked about NVIDIA sponsoring with plenty of people, how much does AMD sponsoring, a new game coming out affect its performance, or, like what does that even mean that they sponsored it? Like, how does that affect your job?
Wow. Like, that's one of those questions that there could be a direct, perfect answer to that. And that answer could exist. And I could be specifically cued that, yeah, go ahead and answer that question, and not have a clue how that affects anything, because it doesn't touch my desk at all. I have no idea how that works, why, who it's touched, who's responsible for what, or how much is there to the idea that any kind of preference or desire to cause, I don't know any of that. I know that my art is benchmarked on the dev kit, and that's what I run with.
Because I've asked multiple developers this on the show before, from graphical artists to people who do the visual effects to you who does both, and it seems like most people say things like, "Oh, I don't know." Like, it seems like most people at these studios don't have their workflow changed at all when NVIDIA or AMD or Intel sponsors something.
I don't know. I know people, actually, but my other passion being making movie accurate horror props, just semi aside that is related, and just happened to bump in that whole fandom into an artist working on God of War stuff, who's in the same fandom, who makes cool stuff too. But yeah, I'll say for everybody I bump into, nobody has a IT team walking around swapping out the hardware in their desktop box based on who's sponsoring what at any given time. And that's really where the only place I would notice anything is when the machine, my workstation, is affected. And my workstation is not affected by that. And I'm not really aware of anything above that level.
Right. And I know you can't directly answer, but that even that in and of itself is kind of a useful answer, I think, to the audience. Like, to your knowledge, nothing changes. And can I add on to this? I'm guessing with Xbox and because sometimes a Far Cry will be in Sony PlayStation ads, and then all of a sudden the sequel, for some reason, it says on Xbox when they do the trailer for some reason. I don't think there's anyone either like walking around from Microsoft like, now you're developing it on Xbox, not PlayStation first. It doesn't really affect anything, I'm guessing, in terms of hardware.
All of that stuff is on a conversational and decision level that has absolutely nothing to do with my desk in any way. It doesn't change the list of animations I have to do and the effects and getting to run right and look gorgeous. Yeah, I got nothing really for you on that, other than, there's no enforcer walking by making that announcement.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be honest. I think then my answer to people listening is likely that if you look at Microsoft sponsor Far Cry 6, which I think they did if I saw an ad correctly online, what that means is they're going to pay for the marketing. It doesn't mean that you have to optimize for Xbox better, nor so with NVIDIA and AMD. Now, the exception I will give is I know that like AA studios and smaller, like 4A Games, who makes Metro Exodus, I think NVIDIA helps them a lot more than usual because they require the help programming the game. That's a different circumstance. But I think when it comes to like mega studios, I don't think much changes except for they get to put AMD on the box for every game sold, and that's an AMD marketing chance. I honestly think that's what it is.
But mainly what this whole chunk is just continue to make me happy that I'm not in marketing, and not knowing any of this is bliss. I am like the better part of this stuff I'm learning today that people are aware of, concerned, and trying to connect dots on all this stuff, where I'm like, I made some pretty stuff and it runs good. That's really where my engagement is wanting to make the coolest looking stuff, run the best, and really represent what the theme and tone of that moment in the game is. And all this stuff is not only just out of my control, but blissfully out of my knowledge.
Again, though, it is just funny to think about, because I think sometimes there is this perception that, oh, you used an NVIDIA-sponsored game for your benchmark list for this graphics card review. And I'm like, yeah, but it ran better on AMD hardware. I don't think they're just walking around swapping out stuff every other year, guys.
Right.
Deepest Learners writes him, and he says, with the new generation of consoles out, a kind of standard compute architecture for gaming has emerged. You have a CPU with main memory keeping track of what is going on in the game, the GPU either on socket or in an APU if it's or on the PCI bus if it's discrete, that draws the scenes, and the storage is a flash SSD over PCIe. We can all see the iterative improvements that will be made to this architecture. Faster CPUs, faster GPUs, more memory, higher bandwidth interconnects for lower latencies, thermal performance between the parts. My question, though, is what do you think will be the next big shift in architecture? Most recently, we moved from hard drives over to SATA SSDs, over to PCIe SSDs. What's next? What is the weakest link here, in your opinion?
I think the weakest link's not in that list. I think the general living room where this generation of consoles sitting, the weak link's the display. I think most of us, including myself, who my TV is chosen because of my love of film, has a gorgeous color range, but doesn't have the expanded color range. It just looks great with my Blu-rays. Runs great with my 24 frames per second playback of Blu-rays. Fantastic. And I haven't upgraded that TV for this gen. So it's not taking advantage of a lot of the features of that Series X sitting under there. And because this paragraph literally says generation of consoles, I think the majority of users, certainly not your listeners who are keyed into how to get everything out of that. I think displays, like, people don't realize that they are past their display with their console.
I just couldn't agree more with that statement. I'm not sure what the next gen will be, whether it will be VR, because I think VR is just a different experience. I think there's always going to be display gaming and VR gaming as two separate things, kind of. But I think people really are underestimating, once you check all the boxes, how big of a difference it makes. OLED, perfect black levels, low response times, 120 hertz, 4K capabilities, which is becoming standard. I don't have an OLED monitor because they're like $30,000 for some reason, but which I think is absurd, by the way. But at the end of the day, I do have a 4K 120 hertz variable refresh rate monitor. It's IPS. It looks fantastic. I have an OLED TV that can do 4K 120. I feel like low response time 4K 120 is going to become somewhat of a standard.
Right.
That's not to say all games need to run native 4K, but with dynamic resolution, it can look better. But I think if you're still gaming like 1080p 60 with an old TN panel, the difference is with HDR. Real HDR is so big.
Right. And I'm aware of it. I don't have it yet. Just haven't done it. Like the screen I have in the main room there for enjoying entertainment, the screen fits perfectly. It's one of those homeowner things. Like, I like that thing. It's there. It's not broken. But when I replace it, I know the difference it's going to make.
Because I've seen some people make this argument. Would you say the Series X, the PS5, this level of performance has enough to pretty much make any game you'll want to make for the next while? Not just compared to normal, but like that it might be hard to push people to the next level of graphics because it's just, hey, look, they're doing it. It's above 1440p most of the time. it's at 60 frames, and it loads instantly. Do you think this is a level where anything past this is going to require just radically more powerful hardware for photorealism? Or like, where do you think we're sitting? Like,
doesn't it feel like we say that every generation? Does it feel like, yeah, gosh,
I'll admit it does,
Yeah.
But I was playing Death Stranding Director's Cut, and I was like, no, this really does kind of look photorealistic, though, in some scenes.
Sure, and and a lot of that is the strides that are made with scanning of materials. I don't know if you're familiar with photogrammetry.
Yeah, mega scanning.
Yeah. And a friend of mine, actually, that's his whole current career. He started, I'm not going to drop names or anything, but that's his thing. Like his little company logo pops up on tons of games because he makes the material sets for all that stuff. And yeah, that's fantastic. Whether to say, nope, this is all we're going to need for a long time is like saying that nobody's going to have an idea that's going to strain this thing. I think we're definitely going to find some way to make it sweat. We'll find something, whether it's a new genre, whether it's my dream of having your I'd always love space stuff, of having your on the ground. Well, I mean, I guess you're trying that with Star Citizen, which I haven't tried yet, but that kind of idea taken to another, there's ways we'll push it. As far as what the average console user is used to, I think it's more than covering that right now. What's expected. But like we said, 30 minutes ago, what's expected creeps along. And if a hardware spec is staying static and the expectations are creeping along, you'll catch it.
Well, I guess let me throw this question in then. Falto asks, how much better are graphics going to get? This might be a stupid question, but is it possible for a game's graphics to be better than real life?
I think all art is better than real life. Like, that's not a stupid question at all to ask someone who, is art serious. But as far as if you mean by better, you mean more photoreal than like hyper real. That talking about as subjective a question as possible, but in no way stupid.
Like, what if we're capable of photorealism, but then there's the Instagram effect of everything is the perfect version of what it would look like in real life? Like, can we get better than photorealistic graphics? And like, it'd be cooler if these colors look this way.
I mean, the amount of, and again, this is in no way based on anything I actually have seen in progress, but this is me just spitballing how we would go. The amount of data collection we willingly let accumulate, I could see over time, and this is generations down the line or whatever, all your options choices in games over time accumulating in a database in your save file, in your profile, where the art is being there's variables there that are on the fly making choices, and the game is very specific to you in a way that is based on your previous choices. That kind of hyperrealism where it feels like serendipity that, the protagonist is driving my favorite car, or it's the right color, or I really like this band and he's wearing that t-shirt, or whatever it is,
to make you like a character more, or a character they don't want you to like. They're like, this guy hates Nissans for some reason, we're going to make him drive a Nissan.
Right, those kind of things that know how to pull on your sympathetic threads or push against them on purpose. I could see, because we were talking about the customization and the amount of work goes into putting all that, but having all that be more transparently tailored to you in a way that's specific to you, to give you a unique experience, that is something that I could see being a path we go down. I haven't seen any movement on that. This is really kind of on the cuff stuff, just trying to imagine where we would go with more horsepower and having, because every time you add customization in any game, you're dedicating an amount of work that any one player is never going to see, right? If they don't choose, give them two characters to choose from to start the game, the entire characters, there's a chance they're only ever going to see one storyline. If you give them 100, there's 99 of the percent of your work's not going to get seen. So we start talking about the stuff I was just describing. You're committing to a lot of content that most players aren't going to see. But that is one way to go.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, of like how the game tailors itself to make your experience what you would call the best thing for you. That takes so much obvious work and play testing to make the algorithm not just ruin the game over time.
Right.
But that is something to strive for. I mean, so perfect. My next question then, what hardware is required to make a game that can do that? What would you put in the hypothetical PS6 compared to now? Like, what performance do you think we're going to see out of a console that launches, let's say, in 2026?
Wow.
Gosh, Reese, why does Windows 10 Professional have to be so expensive? Don't listen to that, nerd. Listen to me. You can get all the great Windows and gaming keys you need at cdkeyoffers.com. That includes Steam, Origin, Uplay, PlayStation, PC, and many other keys, including Windows, Microsoft Word, and Professional. Use the offer code BrokenSilicon for 25% off all of these fancy Windows keys and Dashing for 3% off everything on the website. One more time, that's go to cdkoffers.com. They are a fantastic sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead. Use offer code DASHRINK for 3% off everything on the website and Broken Silicon for 25% off all Windows products. Now, back to the show.
It's a fantastic question. I do, like you said before, you think there's always going to be viewing games and VR games.
Well, and I don't think that affects the performance too much either. It's like, okay, so now you're doing 8K 60 in 2026 instead of 4K times per eye times 240, or, whatever the equivalent is for VR. It's all horsepower, in that regard.
But how does that work? I guess the question there is if you dedicate, and again, I know no specs about any company stuff. This is me from someone who's just been around watching stuff go along. What does that do from a input design standpoint, right? Because nobody wants to put on the VR interface. We're not going to call it a helmet or glass because who knows what it'll be. VR interface and hold the controller. And then there seems
Although I think that's probably the best way to play still, because it's just, if it's a shooter, because you're just more accurate if you're used to using a controller. So it depends on the game, though. If you're not, if it's a static game, then it's good to use the motion controls in your hand.
I really liked. Oh gosh, I'm gonna get the name wrong, aren't I? What was the epic one? Not Robo Rally. Anyway, I've played more than a few games that are pretty close to traditional genre games that use the motion controls in a way that really justifies them.
Well, and I would say Super Hot is one of those games.
Okay,
for sure does.
Yeah. But yeah, that would be something that I would like to see a dedication to VR without forsaking the screen, and then find a way to bring the control schemes together in a pleasing way that doesn't feel like you're sacrificing one for the other. That doesn't feel like you have to compromise to make it work on both or one or the other. But as far as hardware, we are so. I don't want to say we're far out over our skis because we know what we have, we know how to use it, but you almost need the idea to justify the desire, right? I need to have that idea of, man, it'd be cool if we could do this thing, but we can't. What we need is X or Y. And
that's not happening that much anymore, is it, on these consoles?
As someone who would love a new genre, that would love that feeling of putting Tony Hawk in for the first time and going, I didn't know I could feel this, right? Like that was a mind-blowing thing. That was something as a kid. I was the kid you took your skateboard to get airbrushed, but I couldn't ride it. To feel that and feel like I was having that experience. I'm ready for another one of those. I'm ready for something I was not expecting to feel. And VR has been the closest I've gotten to that.
I see.
In a long time. And that's why I'm a big proponent of it, and I've had the privilege of working on quite a few VR titles, and have fulfill a childhood dream of working on Star Trek Bridge Crew, and getting to be asked to and expected to dive in on a super nerd level to what every button and switch did on the original Enterprise. Like, that was amazing, and VR gave us a reason to do that, to be able to sit there and you're looking down the panel and you're pressing physically the buttons with your controller. That was a new experience. That was as close as I've had in gaming to something that felt new in a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And
so to steer your answer, though, then it sounds like, do you think you have enough, to put it in a completely imperfect term, but do you have enough bandwidth in teraflops? Do you just want more RAM more than more horsepower? Do you think the CPU is good enough? Because I think in a next-gen console, you would say, well, look, it'll probably be the CPU is better, the GPU is better, more RAM. Which one of those would you emphasize?
Oh, wow. I have to see where the bottleneck comes, right? And luckily, luckily, I am not the optimizing team, luckily. Sometimes I'm asked to give up some of my budget if estimates weren't right somewhere else. Like, hey, you can get X milliseconds to render your particles, but wouldn't it be cool if we could make this other hypothetical thing happen? We tone this down, give this part of the budget over there. But I'm definitely not the person that has to fret over if we can make this thing work. But it does happen.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, because I was expecting more consistent answers from developers, and I expected everyone to say more RAM, frankly, because this gen we only doubled RAM. And usually it's way more than that.
Right.
But it's funny, the Sony Santa Monica guy said he wishes it had 32 gigabytes now, and he'd love at least 64. But then I had Brian Heemskirk say, just give me more teraflops. And I've had other people say, just need more storage, So it doesn't seem like it's a universal thing this time, whereas before it was always, hey, look, the CPU on the PS4 is too weak. Stuff like that.
We're at a point where the bus speeds are so high and your storage is so fast that while your storage is nowhere near RAM speed, you can shuffle those cards around now in a way that you never could before. So it's just not as okay. And I'll be eating these words in a few years, I'm sure. When there's something I really want to do, I can't. But I don't see it. I don't see it right now as any looming sort of Damocles problem.
And previous gens, was it more obvious early, than it is this time? Just
PS2.
to put things in.
PS2 was the one. PS2 was the one where I felt it because the promises were massive, and we made plans. And this was way before my time at Ubisoft. We made plans based on promises, and it just was not there. Like huge scaling back of things happened.
Well, the PS2, it was cheap, but it was pretty weak compared to like the Xbox and PCs. I mean, PCs at the time were so much stronger. It was
what I'm talking before the Xbox even came out. That time period we were developing for the PS2.
I see. And right away, it felt weak.
Right, it was like this isn't it, right? Like this isn't the thing. This isn't what we were shown. Yep.
And that did not feel that way with the 360. There wasn't any, even though it was just, and again, it looks hilarious now, but half a gig of RAM, you were like, plenty.
Right. Well, especially since as far as I knew, it had just gone up, right? So I'm sure, again, I wasn't involved in budgets there. I'm sure there were studios across that weren't just the studio that we talked about pushing for it, that were like, oh, thank goodness, we can breathe.
Well, let me start transitioning then into some final kind of just random developer questions that I think some of these are really interesting. And the first ones, are mostly about feedback. So the Remedy writes in, he says, "Hello, Tom, and welcome, Keith. My question is about how developers see the current landscape of game feedback. Right now, with the recent Battlefield 2042 beta, there's been a lot of hostile feedback with regards to some specific design features of the game. Many people have also come to defend the developers, though, explaining that old builds released for a game beta are inevitable. This is apparently due to how segmented developer teams can be, and how there needs to be a choice on when to cut off active development for a certain build," which is true. Anytime a demo is shown at E3 or something, that's like a vertical slice. They need to then freeze their development of AI, everything. It really is. I guess what I'm saying is he's not wrong. Like, it really is like an outdated build anytime they do a beta. Having said that, I'm going to speak for myself here. I feel like that excuse is used a little too often, but can you at all elaborate on how beta builds for a game are determined and some of the nuances? And maybe share some of your thoughts on how game developers and gamers can better communicate with and understand each other for the betterment of the industry. And thanks for coming on the show, because I've noticed a lot of developers kind of ruin a game when they take too much feedback. I think there's a certain amount where you need to know what people want more than they do. Like, that's what made you successful in the first place. No one told you to make a game. You made a game you knew would be good.
Right. I that last statement, I think, applies far outside of games in general to, product makers in general. If they hit that home run, nobody asked for that home run. That's why it was a home run. It's like, I didn't know I needed this. This is fantastic. But as far as beta, and what constitutes when it's time to call it that, like, I'm going to put on the old man hat and be, boy, I remember before my time where I'm at now, betas were an internal moment where we knew we had content complete, but we're not done yet. This is full of bugs, may not be balanced, but that's okay. Nobody's going to see this. We're going to sit here and turn these screws until this is ready to be seen. And we're not in that place anymore. We're in a place, actually a fabulous place, where there are rabid fans that want us to succeed. And again, I gotta stop saying us, because I'm not really talking specifically about this 2048 question, because that's great that it's framed outside
2042. How dare you get the year wrong?
I haven't played a Battlefield for a long time. The industry's in a great place where this team has fans that want their stuff to be great, are waiting for it, are clawing for it, and want whatever they can get their hands on. And I could see very easily how it would happen where all of their desire and expectations for what is coming are focused on the state of this slice. And I think if you zoom out, it's a cool problem to have. You have people that care like that. And I'm sure if you zoom out further, you'd see that this vocal chunk of people will be have had this before and had stuff work out and had the final product come closer to what they were expecting. And like you said, there's cases I can think of games that I wanted that promised changes that didn't show up, that the beta was pretty close to what you're going to get. I think we're probably ready for some language changing, because beta was supposed to be, comes from internal development lingo, and, we might need to establish some new verbiage for what you're seeing, whether you specifically, I'm not even going to, because I'm probably going to accidentally pull some verbiage out that is being used somewhere, and somebody's going to think I heard something. But yeah, some of this communication stuff, they probably need to come out and say, we would like to show you this, to demo this, this, and this, specifically about this. So you get a taste of what's coming. We want to hear what you say about it. And we may or may not take your feedback, because you may not realize why. Because there's so much other stuff that's still coming, or because of the limited scope of this chunk of the slice of the experience, the reasons for this may not be apparent. But the verbiage of beta itself, I think, is a little bit loaded in people's mind, because they might be thinking that it's something it's not, to some extent. And again, verbiage, it's something different every time. Because like you said, sometimes it doesn't change.
I was going to say, because I think it depends what you mean. Like, I'm trying to think back to really old betas and even alphas I played. Like, I think with the game Mag, it was clearly pretty much done. They just had to do radical rebalancing of where machine gun nests and stuff were placed, because they're like, you just can't win this map. I mean, we need to fix this. But that was, none of the guns or balancing or class systems really changed, to my knowledge. And that's because they were feature complete, basically done. But then I think there's other games, and I just feel like developers, if I'm going to be a little critical here, can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh, this isn't done, and then go, oh, we released the exact thing you play. It
Right.
turns out we were actually so close to launch that this was done, and we said that because we didn't want you to not buy it. And
Right.
I don't know which way it is with this new Battlefield, because, for example, I played it and I actually felt the playability was better than any Battlefield beta I played in a very long time. So I thought the playability was there, but like they just didn't have classes really. They just had these things called like specialists. And I was like, what are you doing? And it's not clear if that's going to be in the final game or not. But that is one of those things that's pretty radical to the gameplay that they can change before launch.
Yeah, it's fascinating watching it as someone. I haven't worked on a massively multiplayer. I'd be careful of that verbiage because that's going to mean MMO stuff to people. But a large, popular, anticipated multiplayer type thing in a while. But we were talking about how complex games are. You're now, when you're talking about a game like that, you're talking about now we're putting servers, network load, all this stuff into the equation, which is something. How do you simulate that without running something like this, without running a beta or a test or whatever you want to call it? So if you have to do that, you might want to leave the door open for tweaking things.
Maybe it should be done like months before launch if you really think you're testing major systems, in other words.
I don't know if that's enough time. I don't know if that's enough time. But yeah, this is kind of a rock and a hard place thing with a game like that you need to get into a large number of players' hands to make sure it works the way you expect it. And
I mean, I guess to drill into kind of one of his specifics, though, is there any insight you can give as to why my understanding is that when they're doing a beta, the game's almost done usually. Like the maps are done, the guns are done, the teams are done, and they're like, we need to test it, both the servers and the mechanics. So what we're going to do is pick one of the maps, maybe two, and we're going to give it out for free, and we're going to pick the physics and the vehicles that we can fit into a package under 20 gigabytes perhaps, so it's actually downloadable for everyone quickly. And then you're going to be able to play it for these hours on these nights. And at a certain point, how many months before the beta comes out do they just have to stop? Is it like a month? So in other words, is the build people played for Battlefield 2042 a week ago, was that a build from a month ago? Is this a build from July, June? When do you cut it off and say, this is the beta build, this is what we're going to use?
I think, again, that comes down to your reason for putting it out. Is that a showcase for you and your team? Or is that something you need to see the results of to then go and know what you still need or don't need? Like the reasons behind putting that out are going to be different based on the game.
Mm-hmm.
It's so non universal.
Mm-hmm.
So non-universal. And again, I've worked
It's
on...
hard for you to guess then, right? Because it could be a 3-month-old build, or it could have been just in 2 weeks they took a map and put it online, basically.
It could have been that day's build that they were working on the night before. It could have been something that they personally tested for a month. There's no way for me to know. I would just encourage all fans of all these games to just keep in mind that the reason you're being asked to play this could be numerous. There could be a million reasons why they want... There's a reason why you're getting to play it before it's not called alpha or beta or test, public test server or whatever it is, because they need you to do some stuff. They need to know if this is what they thought it was.
So this, I think, also transitions into the next question here. So Type 2501 writes in, and he says, hey, Tom and Keith, I would like to ask for some insight about the unique situation of game development that leads to so many delays and mishaps despite the best effort from the devs to do good time management. I work in theaters where no delays are allowed. Improvements can be made after the premiere night, but when the house is open, everything has to be there and work. So we can only plan accordingly and improvise when we have to, but we have to improvise if we have to. I'm in no way suggesting game devs are not always working as hard or nor as smart as anyone else, but yet it seems to be impossible to accurately plan a development from the beginning to gold. What are the unique difficulties you guys have to overcome that makes this so hard? What is the most common source of delays and changes of plan? Sorry for such a long question, and thank you again for Tom and the guests for making this podcast possible. And I want to preface this question, or I guess add on to this question. I brought him up, the guy from Sony Santa Monica. We talked about God of War, and and I brought this up in the podcast, that I've talked to people within Sony on good authority. They really thought God of War was going to come out in 2021. They really thought it was. And yet it was delayed, and most people thought it was going to get delayed. And they insisted to me, no, it was going to come out 2021. I know everyone said there's no way it will, and then it didn't. But, if people can guess and get a delay is going to happen most of the time correctly, at what point can we just not plan anything? And that means if all games get delayed, then that means there's something systematic that's causing all games to be delayed because it's consistent. And this is a question I keep asking developers that I have on, why are all games delayed? What's going on? If you can predict that all games are going to be delayed as someone sitting on the outside, then it's frustrating for gamers, because then you go, well, if we can always know it's going to be delayed, why internally doesn't everyone always know it's going to need more time?
Well, if you knew it was going to need more time, then you'd also have to know how much more time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you knew it was going to need some more time, you're going to plant a new flag in this moving amorphous thing, it's also going to be wrong. But to pull a phrase that was stolen from an author, and you'll recognize what I'm referring to, but the unknown unknowns.
Mm-hmm.
You can't know the unknown unknowns. And every delay I've been a part of, across 25 years, was different than the delay that was from the project before that. It's the unknowable, unknown unknowns. Whether it's as simple as, and this goes back to that first PS2 title, where we got to a point where we had our systems in and we're flying around, and this is what we envisioned. This is the game we envisioned. We're flying around on these dragons, riding around as Ozzy, and it's brutally frustrating and not fun. It's just not. So what do we need? Lock-on missiles. But they're dragons. Don't care. We need lock-on missiles because that'll make it fun. And damn it, if it didn't make it really fun. But that's the thing we didn't expect to develop. That's not something that we knew was coming. It's an unknown unknown, and a brilliant designer realized that it's pretty easy to strafe and tag if we put in a tagging system, but it's really hard to stay behind somebody long enough to claw and grab them. With a really simple mechanic addition to this game that we didn't schedule for, it's going to go from on time and not fun to really fun. That's just one of those unknown unknowns. You can't schedule for that.
So if it usually takes a delay, though, and it's an unknown unknown, I guess, to be fair, one thing I'll notice is that games are not being announced ahead of time that often anymore. It's basically half a year before they come out, because everyone at least is aware of that. But still, do you think maybe developers should just give themselves consistently an extra half year to what they think, even if, literally work as hard as they can, say this is when it'll be ready 3 years from now, and then say just give it an extra half year, and maybe just publishers should accept that from now on? Or do you think this is just always going to be in an amorphous release date industry?
The hard numbers on the stuff that I'd be speaking of change every generation, so I'm not going to give any hard numbers, but there is a math to securing shelf space and pressing discs from your various console platform holders. Things have to be set up with dates. We're never going to get away from that. That's just a thing that has to happen. You have to get in a queue that, hey, we're going to have a thing done. If you don't do that, then you're going to be sitting with a finished product and then getting in line to. It's just that's not feasible either. I think we're getting better and better, even though, from your perspective and other perspective, it's a endemic delay thing. From what I've sat and watched from inside teams for the last 25 years, we're getting better at estimating stuff. And whether or not that translates to what other teams and other companies communicate with their marketing, what their marketing tells them, I have no control over that. But I do know internally, to the teams I've been in since 1998, we've gotten a lot better person to person, being able to communicate how long is this going to take you, and building a plan and hitting that plan. And it's early on in my career when especially we're going from literally 2D games, we're literally it's just sprites. The first stuff I was doing, do you remember the Flick file format, FLC?
No, I don't.
Okay. Well, like all the art was crammed into essentially a movie file that each frame was referenced in the design doc.
Oh.
But yeah, it was totally different universe. As we switched into 3D, like there was no way to estimate anything. Like nobody knew how long anything was going to take. Internally, teams, every generation, every studio I've gone to, gotten better and better at that. So where the disconnect happens past us, I'm not really sure where the buffer time or pad time could be added on that side of things to make unknown unknowns less of a problem for the consumer. But it's kind of disappointing that people feel like that's a to be expected thing, because I feel personally on teams I've been on, we're better and better at that. And we've had, especially as someone who has had more experience every year, better at me and my teammates calling out wait a minute, we didn't include this. Wait a minute, last time might have been a decade ago, we had to account for this. Like the generational knowledge of the industry itself is coming to a point where it exists. Whereas
it's more consistent, because that's an interesting point you bring up. I feel like now finally, since the past 10 years, we're maybe past 15, we're on a consistent 3D type of game and file systems, even universe of what a game is.
Right.
Like games were radically changing, and even how they ran. Now it's like, okay, we generally know. So now there's finally, like you say, some generational wisdom that's going on, because games are actually being made the same way for more than a decade, which is an interesting point. I mean, games weren't even made the same way with similar teams since pretty much the 360 era, basically. Again, Halo was made in a year. I mean,
right. I mean, I'm not sure how entirely fair that statement is. The game concept and what you did in the game, yes, but I believe they were showing off the RTS version of that game before then as a Mac game, right? That engine,
yeah. I think in 99 or something.
Yeah, so there's some underpinnings. They had a nice platform to sprint from. But even then, what a triumph! I can't say enough about what they did with that. But yeah, the first few years of my industry experience, every project almost had let me bring almost nothing with me. It's just so different. Every approach to how we do things was so radically different. But industry-wide best practices basically are becoming more and more the norm. And if the industry was trying to do games as big as they're delivering now, without that stuff that has built up over generations, I don't know how you'd schedule anything. We have young developers going all the way up to people who have more experience than I, and the wisdom going back of that's not as easy as you think, or we need to test this idea first separately in a white box, knowing that we need to prove something before we pin the hopes of this whole branch of the game on it. All these things is, I'm not going to say new, but it wasn't there when I was starting.
I think we finally got to a pretty satisfying answer to that question then, which is that you are getting better at it. It's always going to be harder than other industries, but at least we can agree that the industry hasn't been the industry it is for more than 10 years.
Yeah.
I
think you melted that whole thing down in a few sentences very well.
All right, so let me move on to some final questions here then that really don't fall into any category, but I thought were good questions. So Clean Sweep writes in and he says, "Hi, Tom and Keith. Just a quick question about the UI in games. How much of a nightmare is it to design something that needs to be legible and scalable across an insanely variable set of screen sizes, even though there may not be tools to allow for proper prototyping before implementation, and almost no QA testing will be done on some of the, I guess, more rarer screen resolutions and larger screen sizes. It seems to me that in an era where customizable UIs are becoming more of a thing in some games, the industry doesn't really actually do a great job of figuring out how to accommodate the wide variety of setups gamers have. Never mind actually accessible issues like text size or anything like that that isn't a color grading option.
Okay. UI it's definitely a science unto itself. And it's all kind of individual to users as far as how much you want to even notice the UI is there. Some people I've seen campaigns against the mini map, but that's almost an aside there. UI, as far as how much of a nightmare is it to design something that needs to be legible? Designing a UI to start with is a kind of a nightmare, because at the end of the day, you're covering up your window into the world with hopefully the bare minimum of what you need. But it also, you kind of want that UI to be instantly recognizable as that game. Like, I feel like the teams I was on first started talking about this with Metroid Prime, because that screen, you any frame of a playthrough of Metroid Prime, you knew that was Metroid Prime. That was that kind of thing. So you want to be able to inject style. You want it to be themed. You want it to be the right tone, and you want it to be usable, accessible. And to throw that monkey in the wrench, we're in an era where not everybody's running on a 4x3 CRT, and now we're not just running on a 16:9 LCD. There is a wacky and wonderful world of resolutions and proportions out there. And I've worked on. My brain is swimming with a lot of factors here. There was a time when I was working on a project a while ago where we experimented with actually eye tracking.
Oh.
To see how people were using UIs and how often they would dart to one corner or the other, and what they were actually looking at, what they would notice. If coming out of a color spectrum to show something was actually useful. And there is a lot of science and effort that goes into all that. It's really hard, we learned, to do the right thing for everybody. And like he was mentioning, the future of customizable UIs, and we talked, gosh, it could be an hour ago at this point, about preferences carrying across multiple games and tailored experiences. That might be one of those things that absolutely falls into that category of, you boot up your game and it knows you're a large type person. Like my eyes are aging. I enjoy some nice large text fonts. But accessibility wise, I definitely see sorry if there's some very specific issues that this person has run into, but there's so much more of a focus on that than there ever has been. I know it might be, a color grading option might seem like a gimme. It didn't used to be there at all. We didn't. I remember a time when I first saw that in a design spec, and I was like, why are we? And it hit me. Wow, half the effects I'm doing aren't showing up in any kind of contrast against the back. There's more we can do. But yeah. And then, my son's friends, I didn't realize it till later. They're literally playing old games I worked on that I've dragged them through, and I find out they're colorblind. So yeah, I realize that's a thing that you can always do better on. You can always do more on. But we're doing, I feel, steadily, like other things we've talked about, steadily better. The fact that we have options at all, obviously, it's never enough if people don't feel accommodated. But gosh, it's so easy to just take a few year step back to where that wasn't in design specs at all across the industry.
What I would say is it was just, I want to say about 5 years ago when 4K really started to become somewhat of a standard, and half of the games you booted up, the text was the size, was microscopic because for some reason they only could render text up to like 1080p or something like that. And now we have much more scalable UIs for higher resolutions. Although, frankly, I think a certain amount of that, though, is just, I think developers just assume everyone's above 720p or above 1080p, and that makes it so much easier. I know that on some older devices, like my mom has this ancient iPhone. When she pulls up the YouTube app, she can't even see more than like the first 3 words of a video on a list when she's looking to click on something. And the pictures, you can't even make it out anymore. But that's because they've updated iOS so much that they're just assuming you have like a 4K screen or something around there, or 1440p or higher, probably. Like how much of this, like the weird screen size options has gotten better just because you guys kind of assume everyone's at 1080p now?
Well, that has helped, and there's also the factor of going back. I remember when the font for the game was on a 512 by 512 with transparency, and not a multi-transparent set of transparent. It was a hard alpha transparency on-off.
Like this is the size of the text that will pop up, basically.
Yeah, and on what we used to, I don't know if it's still, I don't know if it's going to mean anything anyway. We called it alpha test. It was not a soft edge transparency. It was an on-off transparency. And if you scaled those, they looked horrendous.
Yeah.
Just horrendous. And because it was a paletted texture, it's not going to dither the colors. So those are times that you just wouldn't want to scale your UI at all. Never mind the fact that the other bitmaps and stuff were low res and don't really hold up to scaling. And plus you didn't have hardware, like really good hardware scaling in the console to start with, etc. But then there's the changeover, and I haven't done UI specifically recently enough to know if what the standard is now. But I'm sure the horsepower is there to, if not doing it, getting closer to direct rendering spline-based fonts, right? And if not directly rendering them, runtime prepping them from their source to the resolution you want. We all have zoomed in on a web page, and the difference between text that's baked into a JPEG and text that's being rendered in the browser. That crispness, that's the difference between a font that's being rendered and a font that's being displayed in an image. And that's what it used to be, and still most of the stuff is a baked down texture of your font being plopped on the screen letter by letter in the game. And that's kind of where your scaling limit is. If it's technically sprite based, there's only so far you're going to blow it up without it looking horrendous.
Which I remember that was another thing. Some games, the font and the prompts would scale well in 4K, but then they just look hilariously bad. But now that we moved to like an entirely different system, it's really just not, I guess it's not, the UI itself is a lot of work, but then scaling it isn't as much of an issue anymore. I guess 21:9 monitors probably throw a little bit of a wrench into it, right? But
I can't imagine on some of those, I haven't played on one of those ultra wides, but literally turning your head left and right because your mini map's over here and your, I don't know, ammo or gas or whatever's over on the left. That's got to be quite an experience. If that becomes the standard, and you would know better than I, does it feel from a consumer level that's where we're heading, is ultra wide stuff?
It's funny, if you would have asked me that a year ago, I would have said maybe. But sitting here in 2021, almost 2022, all of the newest 4K gaming monitors, 1440p gaming monitors, the overwhelming majority aren't 21:9 still. And I don't see the consoles changing that anytime soon. I think what I would look for as an early indicator that that's going to become a standard is LG says, hey, our new OLED for 8K TV is 21:9 or something like that. I haven't seen... Because you would think this would be better for TVs because movies are 21:9 more so than it is. But I'm not seeing it. I'm seeing phones move to 21:9 because that makes them thinner. But I think that's a different circumstance. So all I can say is I think it's here to stay. But I think where it's at now is probably going to be where it's at forever, where 16:9 is the standard and 21:9 becomes a mainstream, almost mainstream alternative eventually. But I don't see it being the standard just yet.
I think I completely agree with that. I'm a fan of the 16:9 because I sit there and I might watch a film on here, like you said, but I'm also going to sit down with my tablet and draw, and I don't need it. I don't draw giant landscape-sized stuff. I might want it portrait, I might want it landscape, and I want the real estate high and low as well. because I'm not just consuming on this monitor, I'm also creating. So I hope it doesn't go away. I hope you're right. I hope that's going to be a dual
You're asking
standard.
because you don't want it to go away.
Yeah, I like it. And I also was happy to get rid of 4x3 because as a cinema fan, that was too smushed laterally.
Mm-hmm. I think what we're going to see is more and more laptops experiment with more 4x3, 16x10, because if you're on a laptop, you open it up and you might do word processing work. But then I think there's going to be the ultra-wide monitors for people that want that all-encompassing view. And in fact, you said, oh, I don't know if I want to look at the mini-map on the side of the screen. I think some people with ultra-wides kind of like that because they see it as immersive, almost like they're looking down in the cockpit and seeing the map off to the side. Now it's not encumbering their main vision as much, So I think it's just for a type of person, and they don't probably see that as an issue. But the game has to do it correctly.
I love mini maps for the record, but I've read numerous screeds on how it's time for the mini map to die. But it wasn't until you just mentioned that I just kind of hit me that not only is this viewer commenting on what are we doing to make these things scalable and adaptable and some of the stuff we have slowly pruned over generations from UI could come back and not be obtrusive in a new wider standard. That's kind of a neat thing that my brain is now mulling over. Like what did we decide we didn't absolutely have to have that we can now have back? That would be kind of neat.
Exactly right. And and I guess it would be a failure of unideal if a game for some reason in 21:9 mode it just rendered the mini map in the center of the screen still instead of off to the left. Right. Like then you go, okay, well but I think most developers know to not do that. Although every now and then you see, things pop up. Travis Gooding writes in and he says, are there any primary and or support studios you'd love to work together with that you haven't had the ability to before? For example, I heard Capcom was thrilled to work together with Sony's VASG and other Sony Santa Monica mocap stage for RE8, and EA used VASG for Call of Duty. Well, probably not for Call of Duty. You probably mean to say Battlefield. But yeah, so are there any teams like that you've worked with or that you want to work with? Because there's some cross-pollination here.
There is cross-pollination. We're not one studio where I'm at now. So we do have teams all over, and I do get excited when I get to work with this team again, or I get to use this mocap stage, or I do, but it's still very internal because we have variety and diversity, both location and makeup of the place and their specialties, and I don't have access to it all the time. It's when I need it. So I get excited about that. Like, oh, we're going to bring these people in. So yes, but not the way those people are doing it.
Okay. I was going to skip, but you brought it up, was from Pollard, which is the differences in strategy between how companies reveal games now. And I think I am going to paraphrase it here because I think we've been going a while, but Pollard basically asks, what has been caused this change in excitement in revealing games? And I think I know what he means. He's kind of saying, was there a big backlash to how Watch Dogs was shown and the game a lot of people felt was different than what the trailer showed, or for other games like the Division reveal trailer and the game was really quite different? Because it seems like now there's more of a list of stats that they show and then a small trailer, and there's less of this big bombastic reveal. Is that because the reveals weren't working well, or can you speak to that at all and how games are kind of rolled out?
I can't speak to the part of why certain things were made and then the perception that they aren't now as far as the reveal shows. I'm going to agree. I read this question and there's a lot of stuff I just can't touch in there, but I will say I also loved those reveal trailers, and several of those, well, mainly the Division, I wasn't on that from the beginning, and then I got the privilege of getting to touch it at a certain point, and my introduction to it was that trailer, and boy, did it get me pumped to work on it. I just wanted to be able to, in case anybody who worked on that trailer hears this, thank you. That was what I needed to start that whole thing. That was awesome. But no, I'm not aware of any strategic change, and if I was, I obviously couldn't talk about it. That's not, again, I'm thankful that marketing does what they do, and I'm doubly thankful I don't have to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, and I don't want Pilar to feel like I didn't try to ask the question, but it's like, I feel like there's only something you can speak on. But he does bring up a good point, though. That is true. I remember like the old E3. This is the division, and then it's just that doesn't really happen as much anymore. Does it?
I don't think. I think he might be onto something, but I think might be targeting it too narrowly. If he zooms back and look at E3 itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of these big conventions, that seems to be changing too. Because information flows so easily now. We don't need to necessarily gather everybody together and have these take your opportunity and hit the home run marketing moment thing now, because anybody can access their audience much more easily than they used to be able to. So maybe there's a change that has to do with that. I'm not sure, but I'm certainly not sure specifically on anything. I don't know of anything, and on top of that, we all know I can't say it if I did, but I don't.
Yeah, but it was fun though, right? Wasn't it on E3? So when they just had those big reveals one after another, and it's like, who won, Nintendo, Sony, or Microsoft? You know,
I had the luck and privilege of going to the GameCube. GBA, what else revealed that E3? I was at that one, and they had a full half pipe indoors with Tony Hawk and Bucky Lasik, and I hope Bucky was there. I remember him being there, but you know how memories are. My brain may have filled him in, but pretty much the whole Bones crew in my head was there, but it probably wasn't everybody. But in my head it was, and what a spectacle! And you know, I hear people talking about E3 now. I'm like, I don't see. I think that the flow of communication and information has made those events not what they were, probably.
Maybe not obsolete, but obsolescent. Not necessary to get what you want.
And maybe and hopefully we stop worrying about if they're obsolete and just go back to them, because they're really
every now and
good.
then, at least.
Yeah. Maybe not feel like we have to not make them feel like an obligation, but feel like a celebration. That could be really great.
Yeah. Well, and I guess what I would say to his question too, though, I will add this, is people complained, you know, is Killzone 2 going to look as good as the reveal trailer? You know, is Watch Dogs going to look as good as the reveal? Or, you know, I mean, people complain enough. They're like, you're right. We'll stop doing it. Well, that's all of the main questions. I mean, the only other thing I would bring up is, let me see here. I have one more question to round it out. But before I get to it, just, is there anything else you would want to talk about? Because we've been going for a while here. I understand if the answer is no, that we'd want to talk about that we didn't cover, or like, or like, even let me ask you this, like, what's one thing most people get wrong about game development? Like, I think that's a good question to ask everyone.
I think one of the themes of a lot of the questions I struggled to gracefully work through, the idea that we're aware of everything going on at all times, and just how compartmentalized some of this stuff is, and how excited I also get when I get the copy of the game I worked on, because I haven't seen all of it yet. I haven't seen, you know, if there's pre-rendered cutscenes, I probably haven't seen any of them. I'm not working on them anymore, and those folks have been working on them pretty close up to the end too. And it's a celebration for all of us too, and we're often just as excited as you are to see all of our work finally come together. I mean, not saying that nobody's seen it, and this would be a good time to shout out just what a fantastic and important part QA is, because they have seen all of it. But you can tell from my
maybe too much so.
Right. But me, who's just trying to get through my task list and get through the QA bugs coming back on the work I did, I don't, you know, let's say it's a short game, it's an 8-hour experience. I don't have 8 hours to do that every day to go through. I'm working on my task list. So to get to go through that stuff, sometimes we're just as excited as the fans and the customers are to go through that The best example was when I was working on Far Cry 4. We worked on some very specific parts of that, and I never had time to even go through the single player part. I wasn't working on that. And I got to see some of that stuff for the first time. It was just amazing experience to see how all of that came together.
Yeah, and I think that's something people lose sight of, that anyone who works on anything, everything is so complicated now. Everything takes so much work, not just the games, but the hardware themselves. Like for the example I was talking to you earlier today before we started recording, like an example I would like to give is, like when I'm doing leaks about the consoles and the hardware in them, some of it is Microsoft, for example, has done a full hot chips presentation where they break down every little piece of the silicon. So we know pretty much everything about that. But Sony's holds things pretty close to the chest. And that even people that I know that are contacts at AMD do not know every part of that APU. And I asked one of them recently while I was working on a leak, like, is this how the PS5 works this way? And he was like, I honestly don't remember if exactly it has that function or if this part has that. And this was someone with direct work on the PS5 APU. Still didn't know if it had this one feature or if this feature was at this level. Like the same goes for games. Like not every game developer knows every part of the game or why it works that way. Or even what's in the consoles. Like you may not know every part of what you're working on. You just know that we're getting this much frame time if we do this.
Yeah, and I fully admit some of the amazing questions that you came from your viewers are above the level of knowledge I have any need to know about on a day-to-day basis. It's just my tool. The fact that my tools run on a setup that predates this console generation. I mean, granted, we're only so many months into it, but still. That hasn't changed. I just can put more and better in, but it does not directly affect my day-to-day life. The fact that what I'm working on as a small cog in is a much bigger feat and a much bigger presentation and a much bigger technical feat at the end of the day. My need to interface with the silicon like that is just not huge.
Yeah. So I think I'm glad you brought that up because I think that is an important point a lot of people miss about game development, just how small of a slice each person's working on. And I think that leads to a lot of misconceptions like, oh, why couldn't he answer this? It's like, well, because he couldn't,
And not only couldn't I necessarily, but if I had heard that answer, and there's been some stuff that's gone by that like, maybe, and like I just hold on, that answer that I might have had, that could be easily wrong by now. Like stuff is so fluid that if I'm not involved in it, I don't have my hands in it day to day. That stuff is so fluid and it's so in motion, it's so changing that why even attempt to plant a flag in an answer that I don't want to misspeak.
Let me move on to the final question then. Jemunine writes in and he asks, hi, Tom and Keith. I'm currently a fresh college student and will be starting game design next semester. I'm curious to what your thoughts are regarding game development with AI assistance being a possibility in the future. Any tips and tricks for starting out in this field? So I guess he's asking two different things. How will AI and machine learning assist game development moving forward? And then also, hey, he's just starting out, like what can you give him for this career?
This is actually when I was looking at some of the stuff we were talking about. This is one I was excited about. Not the one. This is one of the ones I was excited about because this actually has changed so much in the last 25 years. Because 25 years ago, I would say, get your degree in the specialty, whether it's the computer science and engineering, whether it's the art degree, whatever it was, do that. Get that to a point where you can show that you are a master of that, because you can't show game development mastery. But now you absolutely can. You can go grab, I'm not going to put an endorsement behind any one, but grab any of the engines that are out there, grab a sample project, And then depending on what it is you want to master or show your mastery of, make that your own. If you're an animator or a modeler, whatever your thing is, take that and run with it in that sample project. And you're going to learn so much just getting it to work, let alone making it amazing. You can do that. And I'm not saying doing this instead of your college course. I'm saying supplementally and bounce back and forth from what you're learning at school and what you're doing in on your own, because you're going to learn things that you unknown unknowns. You're going to find out what they're not teaching you. Ask those questions
and learn how to solve unknown unknowns when they pop up.
Yes. And you can bring those into the class and maybe take advantage of that resource in school in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise if you weren't pushing it to the limit at home. But the difference between now and 25 years ago, you can enter the workforce ready to contribute to a team in a way that you just couldn't before. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. And then as far as the AI part, I think I can't speak for every aspect, but specifically animation, I've seen some SIGGRAPH presentations on what is being thought of being incorporated into animation with AI, where you'll be able to input a gait. By gait, I mean a style of walking. What does this character look like when he's walking? What does he look like when he stops? How much does his weight shift? And using AI, plotting footfalls across a massively uneven terrain, and incorporating other little style clips the animator provides. Like, okay, if he gets off balance, I want him to grab his chest, and the style and the flavor still coming from the artist, but interacting with the terrain on the animation side. I've seen experiments with AI used for that is exciting in ways I didn't predict. Like, we're talking about stuff like, what are we going to use all this horsepower for? That is like, I was trying really hard not to pick the bones of this question earlier. That's part of why I was kind of just hemming. It's like, do I do it? Do I blow this guy's question up? But yeah, that is one of the places where I think we can do some new stuff.
So we'll use the new horsepower for all these really, really specific micro actions that we couldn't do before, but AI's allowed us to put together algorithms to show it all, right? Because you can't just like animate every square inch of a tree, but you can have an AI, put together some stuff that allows the game to know where to put it on everything, right?
Or trying to think of a good example. You brought up tree. So let's say you have a character that's going to climb this tree. And right now, you might not have collision on any branch smaller than X or Y,
right? And
play a climbing animation, and then maybe on a few big branches you have a nice flavor animation of a reach, but maybe a generation down, however long down the line, you've got a base climbing animation. You've animated a few flavor reaches and some exhaustion rests, and AI is going to plot and path and bend animations and know to reach around, because arms can
not
only
just
move certain
like
ways.
Collision through a branch, but know exactly, even little branches, how to like snake your arm through it and stuff.
Yeah, and path find the way, because gosh, I remember watching a presentation. I don't know if it might have been Miyamoto himself talking about it, but some of their goals back on Mario 64. One of their goals, one of the reasons they had resisted doing it, and one of their goals was not to have Mario look dumb running around, right? So their controls and getting the bends in their goal, they spent so much time on the movement and the interaction was to make him look and feel like Mario when he's doing it, and not, hey, it's a 3D character that's a model of Mario. I think that is one of those next steps is those animations are eventually going to be more than just playing back animations. It's going to be animations as the seed material for the character and what makes their motion special. But yeah, AI, I can see plotting intricate paths through brush and knowing when to duck without having some kind of specifically scripted event. Like the animation AI will see that collision coming and then decide how surprised they are by it. Was it behind something else? And we're going to play the version of the duck. I can see some of that.
Yeah, you think about characters as they're like crouching to stealthily go through a bush, and like instead of just, let's be honest right now, most of the time clipping through the bushes,
Right.
and gamers have just accepted this in their brain. That's how it's done. You know, you could literally have the brush perfectly move across the materials on their vest, and like their hands actually literally push a specific leaf and push it out of the way. You
Right.
know, like it's not just like, you know, canned hand motion leaf moves.
Right.
You know, it's like literally machine learning has allowed us to have all of these combinations from any direction it can do it.
Yeah. And is that PS6? Is that further down the line? I don't know, but we were trying to mentally go through possibilities of the future, and I think that is one of the possibilities.
Right. And my last guest was an AI guy getting into the field of AI research. And he explained how the neural engines actually interface with that. Like that a CPU does something really well if it's a perfect answer. The CPU says, do this, it doesn't. A GPU is good at solving a list of things that are the same over and over.
Mm-hmm.
A neural engine can solve like 1 trillion operations instead of 30,000 that a GPU can do, but it's not the perfect answer. But if you solve 1 trillion operations, you can say 99.9%, this is the answer. So
Right.
You could do that where you have a neural engine and it's like, I'm going to touch this bush. You take the bush polygons, throw it to the neural engine. It solves 1 trillion operations. And it's like, this is how their hand would touch it. It's not perfect, but it's 99% perfect. It looks a hell of a lot better than their hand just clipping through the bush.
There's that. And then there's like specifically with that being absolutely how I think of it as well in the animation world, I kind of like the noise in that system where it was wrong. And then we can have that moment where the character reacts to it being wrong and replants the hand. And that will look incredibly naturalistic. Like getting that wrong once every 60 times, great.
Then just don't hide it. Just have the neural engine go, oh, I got it wrong. And we'll make the character human. We're not perfect.
Right.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That is a fascinating look at how things are about to change. And again, I think to the listeners, hopefully, how much work goes into just doing that, you know?
Right. That's why I like pre-production too, because these are the kind of like conversations I like to have pre-production. And, you know, we have all these things that some tiny percent we carry along as this is something we're going to incorporate. But like, I like these far-flung, like someday that way you can say, we've been talking about this for 10 years. It's time to do the cool, I touched the tree wrong thing. So.
Yeah. The only other thing I will tie in here is to what you first answered, which was getting into, you know, how to get into game development. What you said about just building the whole thing yourself and getting good at it. It's pretty much exactly what the Sony Santa Monica guy said. Yeah, right. He was like, he went to college and his friend just started making gun models and got a job making the gun models. Maybe you don't need to do one or the other, but make sure you're actually doing it yourself too on the side.
Right. And I think I said it, but sometimes I forget. If you're not interested in making the entire game, even just taking one of the classic known sample games and elevating your specialty part of it to parts unknown to make it yours, that's valid too if you don't want to make something from scratch.
You know, I put AI in Half-Life 2 that is significantly smarter than what was in the base game, and look, it works.
Right, that kind of thing. And package that up either in a link or bring it with you on to a convention, like how we met. And you have basically proof that you not only can do the thing, you can do it functionally in the format that they're going to want you to be doing it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think that was a fascinating place to end this conversation. And we've been going for a very long time. I don't want to take up any more of your time. You know, thank you for coming on. I mean, is there anything you want to plug? You know, sometimes I have YouTubers or podcasters on and they'll plug their podcast. I don't know about you, though. Maybe you just plug Ubisoft or something.
No, well, A, I'm not here representing anyone or anything. And B, I am basically a super introvert and I have no need for it. This is an unusual event for me. Mm-hmm. When I met you at the Carolina Game Summit, you struck me as just a really cool human, and you're super nice to my son. Took time to check out his work, and I'm like, well, yeah, I'll absolutely talk to you. And then I didn't even realize what a far reach you had until you made me a new friend at work. I was sitting here.
What?
Yep. Maybe a new friend at work. I want to make sure. Shout out to Ivan, who messaged me. He goes, "Hey, you're going to be on Tom's show." And well, now I know you. You're my. I told him, well, you're my friend now. So yeah, we started talking. Made a new friend at work through this interaction. So that was cool.
Well, yeah, I mean, to learn more about how games are made, and hopefully the conversation's interesting for enough people to listen to it that it can be a job, And it really is rare to get game developers on like you for whatever reason. Maybe it's because they're introverts. I don't know. But I mean, it really is an asset to have this conversation, because there are several conversations we just had that I haven't heard anyone else have online. And so now people know how something works that maybe they didn't before.
But I'm sure there's a lot of reasons for that. First, it really is a minefield. You don't want to get out over your skis about anything you're currently working on. So that's why it's very fastidious, about all that. But luckily, I've been doing it long enough that I had enough examples pre anything I'm even touching now, to hopefully shed some light on some stuff, and hopefully get some more and more talent interested in doing it. Because, like you said, this is certainly not an industry that's going anywhere anytime soon. This is going to be one of the main entertainment forces for a long time.
Well, now they're using Unreal to make The Mandalorian, so gaming's even encroaching into.
Well, yeah, it doesn't even have to be interactive. Of course, I guess technically that is interactive, because it's still it's not somebody controlling the game character, but that camera is still giving feedback to the way the world is moving on those screens. It's still kind of the same process, because you move the camera down to track Mando walking across, and that background is parallaxing behind him on those big screens. It's still doing game engine stuff.
Anyways, then again, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it. And I guess we won't plug anything, but we'll just give you an extra thank you. And thank you to everybody for listening.
I hope you enjoyed it.
This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, I don't do this alone. Moore's Law is Dead is a team with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother, Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, and special assistance by Carbon Cry. Find all of our information, including the information of sponsors you can support, at www.mooreslawsdead.com. If you would like to send fan mail or hardware to us, please mail parcels to Moore's Law is Dead at P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. And speaking of fans, patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content possible. The aging business model of spamming ads all over the content is dying. The future of media will be built on fans paying for the content they actually want to exist. And so if you have the extra money, but only if you do, please consider supporting us. For just $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to have your questions read aloud on Broken Silicon, Die Shrink, and Loose Ends, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who would love to meet you and talk to you about computer hardware. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the entire back catalog of Flyover States podcasts and other projects Moore's Law is Dead has done, and thanks in the credits of videos and other perks as well. And hey, if you can't afford to support us, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family on social media, Reddit, and forums, and give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or your preferred podcast app. All of this really does help so much. And if you'd like to advertise on the podcast, hire Tom for consulting, or are a person of interest who would like to be a guest, please reach out to the email address mlhbdead@gmail.com. But as I said, this podcast would not be possible without its patrons supporting it, and so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher producer levels:
Brad Medlin, Telos, GUK, Benny Berlin, Justin Yant, Thomas Rupp, I Love You, Lynn and Jim, Ivan K, Tom Bailey, Mohammed Akwari, Frederick Lau, Metrocore, Justin Parrish, Zachary Martin, Terrence Herod, Drita Full, Phil S, D31337 Antics, The Ninth Duke, Jesse Jaskowiak, Josh Law, JBG, Travis Gooding, The Mechanical Philosopher, Lebo King Kilo, Fatboy Deesru, Daniel Hyde, A Guy in PA 81, Nathan Mose, Cole Addict, Matt Salem, Aaron Close, Juan Garcia, Matthew Landavazo, My Name is Nobody, Judson N, Alethros, Jensen Wang, Hey There's a Kitty, Greg T. Wanchuk, Ivan214, John Jameson, Benjamin Cannon, Matthew Lane, Mark Raidmaker, Jan Rauner, Chris Licata, Michael McGee, Allie Robinson, Eric Jackson, Jonathan, Patrick Groh, Evan Dingle, Dominique Cox, Stefan, Original Ross, Anthony Gareffa, Joaquin Hagan, Total Silo, Sol Connor, Michael Costa, Andrew S., C. Jitz, Aaron Keith, Gregory S. Acker, Endless Logins, Tom Sanfilippo, Justice Brennan, Zuzu Taylor, Trevor Powers, Lenya Nanyan, Daniel Nishmal, Franco Frederic, Dan Galanowski, Ian Clifford, Axel Cisnero, Leighton Perry, Joseph Kierman, Brett Summers, Blake, Donovan Russell, Noah Nicolella, Zlicki, Martin Porshegi, David Cowden, Ricky Tant, Ulam, Patrick J.S., Justin Staples, Freddie Canoas Jr., Stefan Coates, Kiwi Phil, Brucha, Jeremy So, Mitchell Pell, Brett Summers, Eddie Del Castillo, Joseph Loria, Luis Correa, Deke, Cheesy Ramen, Tyler Lindley, Tim Robbins, Jake223, Brian Riggleman, Justin Gower, Caillou Markelli, Dave McCoy, Valco Malev, Gabe Langner, Ronnie, Kalik Souza, Michael Deaton, MJB1, Maurice Courtois, Wesley Sager, Sarcastro, Mai Sharona, Y Truly, Roman, William W. Draper, A.R. Rats, Wakir Khan, Henry Zhang, Stephen Hart, Christopher A. Butler, Greg, Peter Moore, Amy Chief, Justin Thomas, Sam Miller, Sammy Malas, James Anderson, Shakira, Nick Rakin, Holden Mobley, Matthew Lazier, R. Pete Sharma, Meat and Pork, Jimmy N.G., Mats, Gordon Freeman, Benjamin Oshley, Mark Mitchell, Shield TV Couteau, Aaron, John Wazink, Sam Bensel, and thank you to Sahara for the music.